Jon Erik einn fremsti fræðimaður í Evrópu á sviði vinnumarkaðs og samfélagsrannsókna. Hann hefur leitt verkefni norræna samfélagslíkanið, stöðu þess og framtíðarhorfur sem Fafo vinnur af fyrir tilstilli norrænu verkalýðshreyfingarinnar og fleiri aðila. Og Jon Erik mun flytja erindi sitt á ensku en á íslensku yfirskriftin Undirstöður Norrænu, módelanna, visnun eða endurnýjun. Jon Erik, the floor is yours.
Godan dag, frender. First of all, thank you so much for the kind invitation. I have been asked to talk about the foundations or the basic pillars of the Nordic models and looking into the future, whether it's likely that they are withering or being renewed. This is part of a project my institute is conducting for SAMAK, the Nordic Cooperation Committee for the Social Democratic Parties and Trade Union Movement. And we have conducted this research in cooperation with a group from all the Nordic countries. You'll find the reports on the web page. There are a range of baseline studies, 5 country studies, among which the Icelandic one is now on the web page, authored by Katrin Olafsdottir and Stefan Olafsson. And there are comparative thematic reports. The final report, which will also be translated into English, and we will make abstracts from all the others in English, will be presented at the Labour Congress within 3 weeks. So much about that. It's often said that if there is a Nordic model, it's a model with 5 exceptions. And the Icelanders would certainly subscribe to that. It's more a family of models than one model. There are differences in the industrial basis and export structures. Think of Iceland and Norway with fisheries and raw materials versus Sweden and Finland with heavy industry, paper and pulps and so on. There are differences in party structures and patterns of political coalitions. Iceland and Finland are definitely very different from the common image of Nordic models as being ruled by one strong social democratic party for decades, as it once was in Sweden. And the roles of the social partners and then also the state in providing welfare and governing the labor markets are also differing. Denmark and Iceland are definitely different and have a greater role for the social partners than, for example, in Sweden and Norway. And last but not least, the ties to the European Union and to EMU are also different. The Nordics span all different connections, as you well know. Nevertheless, there are strong common traits, strong unitary small states, encompassing bargaining systems and labor market organizations, universal welfare provided in the one or another way, free schooling, not anymore universities, except in Norway still, and a legacy of tight cooperation between the political system and the labor market partners. So the Nordic puzzle, which international observers have been discussing lively, is how these models with high taxes, big public sectors, strong unions, and so on and so forth, how can they possibly fly? They contravene conventional wisdom. And the key to understand this, that we argue and suggest in the Normod project, is that it has to do with this basic triangle model in the Nordic countries. First of all, they are all very dependent on international trade, export dependent. This means that macroeconomic policies have to be prudent to secure a sound footing, and competitiveness has to be coordinated with collective bargaining, wage formation, and the interaction between competitive markets and strong solidaristic wage policies, compressed wages, means there is a strong push for restructuring and reallocation of resources from the least productive to the most productive companies and sectors, also meaning that mobility in the labor market has used to be high. This requires support from the welfare state, the third pillar, for income security when you're out of work, for training if you need new skills, and active labor market policies, which is the third pillar. And our main line of argumentation is that it's the interaction and the coherence between these, the policies within these pillars, that are the proof of the pudding. It has to do with equality, collective risk sharing in terms of social protection, making people dare to take new risks, broad investment in human resources, in training, education, and mobilizing labor, where Iceland definitely are world stars, and looking upon welfare as a productive factor. These interactions between politics, institutions, and markets have, over a long time, definitely with breakdowns and crises in between, never forget that, and you're reminded of it recently, it has produced a high level of productivity and restructuring, based also on another key feature, which is not given once and for all, trust. You have seen it in Iceland. It was high, it broke down in recent years. Can it be restored? Relatively even power balances, which provides conditions for coordinating between these three pillars. So this is definitely not an a la carte menu where you can pick and choose and forget about, for example, as many bourgeoisie parties and the Economist in their famous article about the Nordic supermodels, they didn't even mention trade unions, except that the Swedish government had curbed their power, which was apparently very good. But we argue in this project that the strong union movements have been an indispensable part of this, as a counterforce, as a pressure for the other actors to adjust and to provide capacity for coordination, which has not always succeeded, as you well know, in Iceland. But then, nevertheless, you see, the Nordics are on top in all international rankings on trade union density. Norway a bit behind because our unemployment funds, they went bankrupt in the 30s, so we have a state unemployment insurance. But there are other factors behind this: strong white-collar federations and also broad union representation on the workplace. Speaking about the Nordic working life regimes, which sometimes tend to be forgotten in the international discussion, it's always the welfare state, which is important, but it has a counterpart. Multi-level bargaining, important, enabling coordination across sectors, but also between peak organizations, industry unions, and local unions. Compressed wages, I spoke about. Important, very strong peace duty with a state mediator as an important actor. Then there are differences when it comes to legislation. That's often a matter of confusion when Nordic trade unionists meet. The Danes and also the Icelanders have much less legislation and more in the collective agreements than, for example, Sweden, Finland, and Norway has. The strong local tier of unionization and participation means also that there have been channels for negotiating flexibility, not only deregulating, as we have seen examples of in recent years, for example in Sweden. And important those days, the Nordics have had no statutory minimum wages, as almost the only in the European area. But we have extension traditions, extension of collective agreements in Finland, Iceland from the 80s, and recently partly also in Norway. And this is a matter of discussion both within the unions and across unions and employers. I'll come back to that. So, in the final report, which we are busily trying to finish up this week, we use the period 1990 to 2014, the Nordic models from crisis to crisis, as a kind of baseline for discussing the challenges ahead. Just to dwell a little bit about how the Nordics came back after their deep crisis in the early 90s, especially in Sweden and Finland, just to illustrate how they activated all the pillars in the model, so to speak, macroeconomic policies, wage policies, new forms of wage coordination and restraint, which you also had in Iceland, social pacts, differently in Sweden and Denmark, where they decentralized more of bargaining, but the outcomes were pretty similar. Product market liberalization associated with the EU, tax and pension reforms, but not that much change in the labor market, except in Sweden, where they liberalized temporary work strongly in 2007, and also temporary agency work, which proved to be very important when Europe was extended eastwards. The welfare states were geared more towards work, social investment, activation, and for some years there was a successful recovery and revival. So to speak, the Nordics were riding the global wave, and the Icelanders did it in their own way, the financial way, which of course boomeranged. But there was nothing magic, no secret tool in this. It was mainstream tools, but we argue that it was the ability to coordinate and ensure balance between the different measures and adjustments that was the proof of the pudding. In the 2000s, when the Nordic models went to top most of all rankings, Iceland as well, things started changing. Huge labor migration. Iceland had the biggest inflow until 2007 per capita. Financialization of the economies with asset bubbles, not only in Iceland, also in Denmark. And center-right came back in political power. And we saw a range of small changes, not big changes, but there were signs of new lines of division in the labor market, and not in Iceland, but in the other countries, a rising support for welfare chauvinist or conservative populist parties coming into government for the first time in Norway in 2013 and being on the tipping point after the Swedish election now in 2013, really changing the conditions for coalition building. I guess I have to speed up. Looking at the performance of the Nordic models, it's important, especially with a big welfare state, that you have high employment rates, that all people work. And here, the Icelanders, as you see to the right, are world masters, even though the rates have gone down due to the crisis. Finland and Denmark as well have lagged behind during the crisis and are not now that different from many other European countries. The main gap between the Nordics and the continental Europe is that women work, as you are familiar with, and the elderly work more than in, for example, Southern Europe. A rising concern, therefore, is in the other countries, especially in Sweden and Norway, I would say, that the growing immigrant populations have a much lower employment participation than the native population. And in the long term, that may pose new challenges. Fairly high productivity, lowest in Iceland, has to do with the industrial structure, but you compensate by working many more hours than anyone else, providing wealth. But you also see that from 95 to 2012, at least, Iceland had the strongest improvement together with Sweden. Why? Denmark and Norway, with their oil money and huge labor migration, saw productivity growth sacking. Still, these are affluent societies, and Iceland has caught up very well long time ago and is now in the middle of the Nordic countries, measured in GDP per capita, ranked by purchasing power, and so on and so forth. But you also see that it slided during the crisis. So it did also in Norway, surprisingly. Even though GDP was growing all the time, we didn't have much of a crisis, but that has to do with the surge in migration. Population is growing faster than GDP. Going to the crisis, how much time do I have again? Okay, that's fine. If we look to the crisis, the experiences are very different across the Nordic area. You see to the left here, Finland dived deepest, followed by Iceland, Norway least. But Finland and Sweden recovered fast. Iceland a little bit slower, but stronger. And in 2013, growth was highest in Iceland, as you see. While Finland had a different development. After recovery, the Nokia collapse, aging of the workforce, paper and pulp crisis on the world markets meant that they went into a second dive and is still in recession. So if you look to the right panel, you see that Iceland actually has done better than Denmark and Finland in terms of cumulated GDP growth or decline over the period. Finland actually isn't that far from Spain. While Sweden, on the other hand, has been the most successful in economic terms during the crisis, but as you know, not in terms of employment. So you see the countries with financial bubbles are paying a hard price, and Finland is paying several hard prices, which has more to do with structural problems. If you look at unemployment during the crisis, this is familiar to you, but I thought it was encouraging for you to see that despite all the deep slump, Icelandic unemployment has come down much faster than even Danish, while the Swedish and Finnish is still up above 8%. And Sweden is really a puzzle here because they have had strong growth, but unemployment had, so to speak, remained, especially among young people. It may have to do with higher immigration, more school dropouts, and so on and so forth. But this means that in the next 15 years, the Nordic area as a whole has a challenge with unemployment. Now, if you calculate all the Nordics together, it's almost 7% unemployment. That's higher than Germany. It's higher than England. So we're not an island of low unemployment. Looking a little bit more ahead, and that's our mission to give some, not answers, but to point out important challenges and questions for the labor movement. There are certainly a lot of change in the environment, globalization, climate change, prospects of sluggish international growth, rising migration probably, which will test the capacity of the Nordic models and their actors to adjust. it is worrisome to see that one of the institutional foundations, the strong trade unions, who are still the strongest in the world in terms of numbers, but they have been declining in all the countries. I'm a little bit uncertain about the Icelandic figures here, but I've relied on OECD figures, at least indicating a decline also in Iceland. But if you look to Sweden, down 15% in 15 years, if you prolong that, it would mean that they are well below the level of Norway today in 2030. So there's a job to be done. This is especially a problem among the young, but not only the young. If you look at those from 30 to 45, it's going down for every generation. And taking into consideration that you have a biased age composition, there may be an age bomb for the trade unions that will aggravate the membership challenge in the decades ahead. And of course, it's definitely mostly a private sector challenge related to private services. In Norway, for example, around 20% of those working in private services are organized. That means only 1 or 2 of 10 companies have a shop steward, and of course that's a big change. And it feedbacks on the collective bargaining system. In Denmark, they have been discussing whether this means that the trade union movement in the future will be more of a movement for those with high education, the protected insiders, than the vulnerable outsiders. And what would that mean for the public profile, the legitimacy of the trade unions? So even though the strongest in the world, there are homework to be done. Inequalities are growing. This is showing the ratio between the highest wages and the lowest 10%. For full-time employees, you see Iceland is closer to Germany and United Kingdom than the other Nordic countries before the crisis, probably a result of what happened from 1995 to 2007. But it has changed a lot during the crisis. That's the question, will it last? But we see the other Nordic countries, Norway and Denmark, steady growth in pay differentials. We are the countries with the least collective bargaining coverage, with not a tradition for extension of minimum wages in the agreements, and also perhaps with the highest labor immigration, indicating something about the pressures on the tradition and the condition of equality as a basic feature of the Nordic models. Aging, you have probably discussed a lot also in Iceland. It's nothing new, but it will change society. When you have more people above 85, even in Iceland they can't work. Some of them do probably, but still. And the workforce is shrinking. Finland is worse off. It has already started, but this will mean that we have to get employment rates up among those remaining in the workforce age. And when like in Sweden, Norway and Denmark especially, the only groups that are rising in numbers are the immigrant populations with low employment rates. This is going to be a tough challenge to include them in the labor market. If you look at the slide to the left, it indicates the rise of immigration in Norway over the past 25 years. You see the lower one is labor migration from 2004. The right slide shows the differentials in employment rates among different nationality groups. And you see the lower ones are around 50 and below, and that's not sustainable for big welfare states. On the other hand, you have the labor migration putting pressure on wage setting and competing with the most vulnerable groups in the labor market. So, for example, in Norway, in the past 8 years, almost all net employment growth has come among labor migrants, while we have not managed to include more of those being on rehab, vulnerable groups, and so on and so forth in the labor market. Actually, employment rate have gone down in spite of strong employment growth. So this may imply that we have some difficult discussions, both concerning inclusion and how to curb low-wage competition. It seems Iceland has been more successful in that with your way of saying that it's forbidden to pay below the minimum rate in the collective agreement. That's very controversial, especially in Sweden and Denmark, even also in Norway. So the unions have a long way to go to fix this problem. Anyway, to end up on a positive note, I would say if we look around in the world, and in Europe especially, the Nordic models appear fundamentally robust. They have strong institutions, strong economies, flexible labor markets, good welfare systems, and they are basically rich on trust, human capital, and social infrastructure. That's a good point of departure. If not the Nordics could make it, who could? You may ask. But the ultimate question, I think, is, and the Swedish election recently is a wake-up call, the Norwegian and the Icelandic as well could be. Will the electorates, the social actors, and the parties be able and willing to form coalitions that are capable of dealing with the hard questions ahead? That's really, I think, the fundamental challenge for the Nordic models. That means it's political. And it was a political construct, and it still is. Thank you for the attention.